Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations About Horror. I am Katherine Troyer, and I am delighted to, as always, be joined by Anthony Tresca.
Hey there!
This is a podcast devoted to thoughtful discussions about that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text, or, as today, multiple horror texts that are, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we are so excited to have you join us for our double episode over The Shining 1977 and The Shining 1980.
Yay! And I would be remiss to say that we we'll also be touching on the 1997 miniseries, which is actually, Anthony, so you have your whole, story of, when you saw Nightmare on Elm Street for the first time, and that was kind of your first horror. I think for me, one of the first things that I engaged with was the Shining miniseries, because it came on TV, and they, made such a production out of it, and I watched it with my dad, and I remember talking to kids about it at school that we're having nightmares from it. So I think that might be the closest origin story that I have. So
it was pretty well received at the time. I mean, it won 2 primetime Emmys, and winning 2 Emmys as a miniseries, particularly as a miniseries that is kind of coming after the insanely well-regarded and popular 1980 Stanley Kubrick movie. I mean, that's pretty good.
It is. And, I won't lie, not all of the CGI has stood the test of time. Although in the film's defense, or miniseries defense, there are lots of films with much bigger budgets whose CGI hasn't stood the test of time. But I actually think the lead actor who was one of the brothers on Wings, and I can never remember his name.
Steven Weber.
Thank you. Steven Weber and Rebecca De Mornay, they are awfully gosh darn good. The little boy tends to leave his mouth open a lot, and breathe heavy, which I won't lie, I've gently mocked him for. But the acting,
because you don't think children should breathe, right?
Because I don't think children should breathe. Yes, that's really what I'm trying to say. Is it has nothing to do with mouth open. It's just the breathing thing. But I really, really like the miniseries, which is all I need to say. Is I just need to go out on record saying that I like it, but I like it in part because of the origin story, and in part because I think I don't think it is a more faithful adaptation if we're talking about following points in the narrative.
For sure. And the sticking point of adaptation, and because as much as the miniseries is of course its own thing, but it's deserving of its own conversation, I think. The vast majority of our conversation today is going to be basically about the differences in adaptation between the original Shining novel by Stephen King and the Shining film by Stanley Kubrick, because they are incredibly different.
Yes, very, very different.
If you're listening to this podcast, you probably already knew that.
Yeah, that's not a hot take.
Yeah,
it
no.
sound like it was. We were brace yourselves for this. That's a statement of fact, right?
Yeah,
it's one that everyone, including Stephen King, right, is very aware of, because he's talked about.
Kubrick.
Yeah, they've talked about how they were in disagreement about what the source of horror was, and honestly, that right there. That alone, right? If everything else had been a shot by shot, every scene from the novel in the movie, it wouldn't have mattered, because the source of horror for Kubrick and King are different. Mm-hmm. King said that for him it was about real ghosts, and it was about being haunted by the past in a literal way. And Kubrick said that he didn't really care about that literal haunting at all.
No.
That he was interested in the idea of being haunted by one's past, by one's addictions. And
I also think Kubrick is far more interested in the cabin fever aspect.
Yes.
Is present in the original novel, but I mean, it's not as present as in the film.
Yes. Yeah, it's not the source of horror, right?
No,
It's a consequence.
Yeah, it's a fact that if you are staying in this hotel for several months, yes, of course, that's the literal thing of cabin fever. And Stephen King acknowledges that to some extent, but that's not the reason. That's not the reason that Jack goes crazy. Whereas, like, cabin fever is, I would say, pretty high on the reasons that he goes off the deep end in the film.
Yeah, I think that we could see one being the story of what happens when you're stuck in a hotel with a bunch of malignant ghosts, and the other is about what happens when you're stuck in a hotel with yourself. And that's a really important difference. So I want to begin where we often do with our sort of like theory, because I think that for adaptation, it's particularly important to ground what you and I have already been sort of alluding to, and that is that there are different ways that people think about adaptation studies, and one of them is the sort of fan response, which I understand, but I think it's a little limiting, and that's the sort of like fidelity claim, right? Or the focus on fidelity, and it's a focus on how faithfully the adaptation captures the original, and the reason fidelity can be a tricky place to leave the discussion, or to have the entire discussion be, is in part because faithful to what, right? Like, so I remember I think one of the franchises that often gets talked about the most when it comes to issues of fidelity, of course, is like the Harry Potter franchise, right? And I remember people saying, like, I'm so upset because in the book so-and-so's wearing a blue sweater, but in the movie they're wearing a green one, and like I really liked that blue one. But like, so people often get really caught in the weeds or the minutia of fidelity, right? And it goes from there to, I was really upset because this scene wasn't in the adaptation, and I felt the scene was integral to communicating the theme, right, which is as a bigger issue too. Issues of fidelity of, I don't feel like the adaptation caught the spirit, or the sort of essence of the original. And all of that whole range is, right, it's really squishy. It's like, it's really hard to have fidelity criticism be anything other than a sort of like audience response in a lot of ways.
And honestly, it's hard to, I know I'm going to offend some people when I say this, but it's hard to like view anyone who is like, how I judge adaptations is based on how faithful it is to the original, because it just becomes like a nitpicking kind of thing of like,
yes,
oh, this one sentence line, they cut that and totally ignored it, and so like I am totally done with this adaptation. I just feel it's a little bit, it just descends into basically fan nitpicking.
Yes, and I like how you said that, because the theorist that I want to bring in is probably my favorite, of which there are many excellent, but probably one of my favorite adaptation studies theorists, and her name is Linda Hutcheon, and she has a book called Theory of Adaptation, and she actually says, of more interest to me is the fact that the morally loaded discourse of fidelity is based on the implied assumption that adapters aim simply to reproduce the adapted text, right? And so there's this, I think sometimes with the deep-seated, like emotions, it's because it can be easy to remember that the decision to adapt your beloved text wasn't necessarily so that you'd have another version of your beloved text, right? There's lots of reasons, hopefully independent of financial, but there's lots of reasons that people are moved to adapt something.
I think I agree a lot with that, in the sense that there's no need to get bogged down in trying to be faithful to the original. It's just not important. And it also asserts, if your claim is fidelity, faithful to who? Your version of how you read the book? There are so many other people who have entirely different reactions and choose different things that are important from the original work that they think are crucial to making it a proper adaptation. Saying that it needs to be faithful is a foolish game, and it's impossible, because your version of what makes an adaptation faithful is not the same thing as what makes a version faithful to somebody else.
Exactly. And if a text is good, right, and by good, I mean a rich, nuanced text, then, as you said, what I focus on as being the most valuable aspect, the family dynamics, for example, it may not be the aspect that you find most interesting, but it doesn't mean that either one is not present or of equal value. It just means that it's a rich enough text, right, that it can be approached from all of these perspectives. And so I think you're right that this faithfulness discussion often acts as though there is a linear way into a text and there's only one entrance, right? Whereas a good text has multiple entrances and exits, right? You can approach it from so many different angles. And that's really what Hutcheon kind of says. So I want to just share a couple of her ideas because I think it's going to explain why you and I are going to have the conversation we're going to have about The Shinings. So she says, to deal with adaptations as adaptations is to think of them as, to use a Scottish poet and scholar Michael Alexander's great term, inherently palimpsestuous works, haunted at all times by their adapted texts. If we know that prior text, we always feel its presence shadowing the one we are experiencing directly. When we call a work an adaptation, we openly announce its overt relationship to another work or works. And so she says that you know, in order to think of an adaptation, we can't think of it in its own aesthetic, right? But we do need to think of it in this larger conversation, right? And so palimpsest is something that you can read on sort of multiple levels or multiple angles. And that word haunted is good because it kind of creates that like shadow effect, right? It's almost like if you have a document that you can see imprinted on it earlier versions, right? Like, or where people scratch stuff out, right? Like that's kind of what comes to mind for most people when they think of a palimpsest. And so it's that sort of idea. And so she gives us some really excellent imagery other than haunted. She says that, you know, we can think of it as this formal entity that is about transcoding. And sometimes transcoding is switching from one medium to another, but it can also be a shift ontologically. It could be a shift in terms of ideology. Then there's the process of creation, which involves reinterpretation. And then there's also the process of reception, right? And how we experience them through our memory of other works that resonate with this version, right? So, you know, what she's arguing, and this is not an easy claim to support, right? Is she saying that like adaptations are so fascinating because they're shadow texts, and so they are always affected by our interactions with the other texts that are the original, but the original might not be for us the first text that was made, right? So if you watch The Shining, the movie first, and then read the book, The Shining, the novel, may feel to you like the secondary text.
It's kind of like, to use another horror example, it's kind of like the tethered in Us. It's kind of like whichever, it doesn't really matter which one's the originals. They're inevitably connected. And whichever one you interact with first is like what you view as the original, and there's this other tethered thing to it, tethered version of it.
I think that's a lovely analogy. And I think it's a perfect way to think about it.
Because I think that these two texts are incredibly tethered together, and I think the fan reaction is very, very similar to like what you would expect of like Jordan Peele's characters in there. It's like one is good and one is totally evil, but they're tethered together. And which version of The Shining you prefer, you probably think of the other one as being like the inferior, bad version that's unfortunately tethered to your good version.
And it's funny because there are people who the version that they think is the right version is Kubrick's film, right? Mm-hmm. Who see the novel.
Those people are me. I'm coming out strong.
Okay, well, sadness. Because I definitely like the novel better as a text that I want to play with. But I feel like increasingly, the more I force myself to remember Hutcheon's framework, the less I find myself interested in whether or not I like one version better than the other.
Now, I still see both of them in the Hutcheon's framework. Both of them are clearly important. And I'm just coming in. I know I'm going to offend a lot of people in this episode.
I mean, you've offended me, so you know.
But the original novel, I guess maybe we should just jump into a discussion here. This is where we can start. Let's talk about the original novel. It's good. I really like it. I read the novel first before I saw the film, so it's not even that my viewing of the film made that the original in my mind. It wasn't. I read the novel first, and I really like it. I think Stephen King is really good here. He's not always, as longtime listeners know, that I'm not always a fan of Stephen King. And this was one that is. It's one of his. It's a longer book.
It is a longer book.
And I usually have problems with that because I usually am like Stephen King. Someone needed to tell you that not every single sentence that comes out of your brain is genius. But in this version, I actually didn't ever feel that way. I think that
because
the novel
it's still
is appropriate.
Early, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's still early enough in his career that it's long because the story needs it to be long, not because somebody's afraid of being that editor who tells Stephen King to edit.
I mean, it was only his third published novel. So, I mean, this is early Stephen King. This is Stephen King before Stephen King was Stephen King.
So I also read the novel first. And it's my favorite King novel, followed by Misery, for those that are just curious to know. Mainly because I'm a sucker for story within stories. Like, you'll almost guarantee that I'll like your book if you have that going on. But so it's my favorite of his, which I think says a lot right there. But let's kind of dig deeper, right? So we've established that we both like it.
And that we both read it first.
What is it that, in our opinion, makes for a good work of horror here?
I really did care about these characters. Stephen King does a really remarkable job of setting up these characters who are... I mean, Jack is profoundly an unlikable character. He is a profoundly disturbed individual, and yet, on multiple occasions, I still was like, ugh, I just wish things could work out, but they're not going to. He can't. So I really enjoyed the characters. I think also the Overlook as a location for horror is a really, really interesting location. I mean, it's based on a real place that Stephen King went to. It's
a beautiful hotel. The Stanley is gorgeous.
Yeah, using this hotel, this deserted hotel in the middle of winter as your vehicle for horror that's a good choice. So yeah, and I think that if your location and your characters are good, you're setting yourself up for a good story.
Yeah, so one of the things that we can talk more about when we get to Kubrick's version is the character of Jack. So I think you're right, though, that King does a really good job of making you want to see, to have Jack not go down the path we know from the beginning he's going to go down. And I think one of the ways that that is developed is that his creation of the family unit is really strong, right? Both Jack and Wendy are not perfect parents, but they're loving parents. And if you break down the novel sort of by pages, right, a good chunk of the novel is spent pre-Overlook and Overlook pre-shutting down of the winter. And I would argue that it's because we need to see Jack as someone that Danny deserves to have as a father, if Jack could just be the man that we need him to be, right?
Jack makes a ton of terrible choices, even in the real world, which I think is really, it sets it up, because you're like, well, if he makes real choices out here in the real world where there are more tangible real world consequences, when he is isolated, he's gonna be making even worse choices, and it's gonna make sense.
Yeah, there's a tragic, going back to sort of the Greek concept of tragedy with this like inevitability, right? There's a tragic nature to King's novel, because I think you're absolutely correct. We we don't expect anything else, because when he's not in the literal as well as figurative boiler room, right? Like, he still can't make the right decisions.
No.
And so we watch him tragically never be different than he's been predispositioned to be.
Jack is very frustrating as a character, which is, I think, is necessary. It's necessary. He's not a good guy. But I think something that I find really interesting is I always like following these characters who think of themselves differently than they actually are. And Jack is such a good example of that. And he's a character who we get to spend so much time with in the novel. And Stephen King does a really good job of getting us kind of inside his headspace. And that's difficult with a character like this, because I think you run the risk of, like, idolizing a character like this. And I've had problems with this in things before, but I don't think that that's the case here. I think that Stephen King is, by allowing us into the headspace, is not trying to make Jack a better character. It's just like, I want you to understand him. You may not ultimately at the end of the day still agree with him, but you have to get in this head and you have to understand.
Yes, and that is a real advantage of the novel medium, mm-hmm. right? So I think one of the hardest things for anyone who's interested in adaptation to particularly a cinematic medium is that it is really hard to show us the discrepancy that exists between someone's actions and someone's perception of their actions. And you're absolutely correct that Jack really thinks that he's gotten the raw end of the deal, that he is a really good man who has a little tiny problem. And we see that contrasted so sharply from his actions, right? Where, like, it is his fault, no one else's, that, he like abuses a student. It is his fault and no one, or like his addiction is not minor, it's big, right? Like, and so I think you're absolutely correct that the novel does a really good job of developing that.
And then ultimately that's what seals his fate. It's his job that he failed to check the boiler room and maintain the levels within the boiler room. And so, his son knows this, and he knows that it's about to explode. He gets everybody out, but Jack is not. Jack doesn't. It's from his own direct failure to fulfill his responsibility. And we see this over and over again. As a teacher, he fails. As a parent, he fails. As a husband, he fails. And just as a manager of this hotel, he fails in a huge way, because the hotel is bam, boom.
Yeah. And earlier you said that the choice of the Overlook as location, was a rather brilliant decision. But I'm going to argue that part of what makes the novel so, in my opinion, just terrific, is that the Overlook is only a location in the most, like, in the strictest sense of it being a physical place. It's a character, right? And I mean, the Overlook is a character. And I think for me, that's one of my favorite parts about the novel is all of the sections where Jack is down in the basement and he, like, finds the old scrapbooks, and he's, like, building this history of the hotel. And like, we can actually, we understand the history of certain rooms, but we also understand that, like, that it's alive, right? And it's alive, of course, because of the ghosts. But there's the Overlook is the most important character, in my opinion, in the novel, and that doesn't happen very often, right? Oftentimes locations are just settings, but I think King does such a good job of making it so that you understand the Overlook through Grady, right, the old caretaker, through the piecemealing of the history, through the various ghosts that the Torrances encounter. But I think for me, that's probably hands down my favorite part is how developed, again, this takes them a considerable amount of time, which is why I don't have a problem with the book being a little longer, to make this be as strong and nuanced of a figure, right? Because you said that, like, Jack at the end of the day ends up failing, but we knew he was going to all along. The Overlook is too greedy, right? And, like, it has never worked for the Overlook to be that greedy before. because it's still searching for the perfect caregiver. So, like, it's really just watching these characters make mistakes that we know from the beginning are going to be their downfall, and watching how it unfolds.
Yeah. And I think this is a good place to transition.
Ooh, before we do, though, I have one other thing to say. I also think, and we can talk about this in relationship with Kubrick, but Stephen King has a particular writing device that he uses a lot, and that is the parenthetical, where he'll be in the middle of a sentence and then he'll like break down into a new paragraph and have a parenthetical that'll be something like, you know, and he thought to himself, there's something definitely wrong with this. End of parenthetical, and then it'll continue on. Like, he does that all the time, and he does it a lot in The Shining. And I think that, again, in The Shining, it works perfectly because this is all about the headspace. And it's all about the sort of, like, the contrast of those, like, random thoughts that we have of, like, wasn't there something I'm forgetting? No, there must not be. And that's again, really hard to duplicate in a cinematic form. So I think that's the other thing that's really neat about the novel.
And I think that provides a natural transition into talking about the Shining film, because I think what is more important to Kubrick is he doesn't really care about getting us into the headspace of his characters. And I am just going to go ahead and get it out there on record so that people know, I do really like Stanley Kubrick. I do really like his visual sensibility and his direction, and kind of something that he gets criticized a lot for is the coldness of his films. But I find that to be a really big strength in this film. Sometimes I can acknowledge that Kubrick's coldness does go too far, and like it kind of does create a bit of an alienation between what you're watching and what your kind of Kubrick is trying to emulate. Like sometimes in Dr. Strangelove, there's some points in which you're when I was watching that film, I was kind of like, I wish kind of maybe he was a little bit more sentimental here. I never once thought that in The Shining, because I think the coldness that Kubrick is able to bring to these characters and this isolated location is perfect. It's perfect.
This is where I really have to see this as not the bringing to life the beloved novel that I adore, right? But as here is a rich text. I'm going to show you one way we could play with that text. So I'm not always a Kubrick fan, in part for the very reasons you mentioned, that I don't always particularly appreciate that sort of voyeuristic, cold distance that Kubrick is stellar at creating. But I think, again, if I can separate it from that linear path and see it as this sort of reinterpretation, you're absolutely correct that that this film needs to be cold and distant, because that's part of the affect that he's trying to create. That's part of his source of horror.
And speaking of that source of horror, Kubrick fundamentally, when he's talking about the themes, he obviously has talked about like kind of where he started. It was coming off of Barry Lyndon, which was a film he made in 1975 that wasn't a big hit. And so he was like, I need to do something a little bit more commercially minded as well as would be artistically successful. So he was like, I want to do a horror adaptation. And he was reading a bunch of books, and he hated all of them. He was just like, throw them away, until he got to The Shining, in which he just was super engrossed. So it was clearly The Shining that did inspire him. However, he talks about what was fundamentally really interesting to him about the book was that there's something inherently wrong with the human personality. There's an evil side to it. One of the things that horror stories can do is to show us the archetypes of the unconscious. We can see the dark side without having to confront it directly. And I think that this quote really is a good place that shows the splintering between what Kubrick thinks is the most interesting part of The Shining and what Stephen King thinks is the most interesting part of The Shining. For Kubrick, it's the characters, and for King, it's the hotel.
Yes. Which we go back to this, it's the difference in what they interpret as being the source of horror, right? And I think you're absolutely correct that, so there's, I'm sure you've seen, and I'm sure the people listening have seen the sort of famous mock trailer of Kubrick's The Shining that's set up as a rom-com. There's a reason that works for the Kubrick film that actually it wouldn't work if you were to try to do it for the novel. And that's because from the beginning, Jack is created as a character that is alienating. It's not just that he's alienated everyone. He's an alienating presence that is simultaneously charismatic, right? And of course, Jack Nicholson gives us partially that through his performance, but the Jack of Kubrick's film is not. He's not relatable. He's not a good dad. He's not none of these things, and so the film is asking us more like, what happens when we realize that we've been caught in this like, what's it called? Like this spiral effect, right? Where we can't escape the presence of someone that is just wrong. And that's not really what the source of horror is, or that's not really what King was looking at.
Which I found really interesting is because the Jack from Stephen King's original novel, I think takes more horrible actions. He is a much worse. He makes a lot worse decisions, and we are shown him messing up a lot more. However, I still think that the Jack from the Kubrick movie is a lot more unnerving and is actually ultimately the worst of the two. And for me, that's what kind of makes him a little bit more interesting, because I really like getting to putting this character who starts is already fundamentally kind of broken. He is doing a subpar job at masking it. Sometimes it is masked a little bit, but this is not a character who can really even keep it together. And we're shown that right away.
There's a tragicness to King's Jack that is not present in Kubrick's. Kubrick's is, I think you're right, that we see, it is more heartbreaking, the things that Jack in King's book does, because we're like, but really, remember, you are a good dad. You are capable of being a good dad. Now you're trying to kill your son. Whereas in The Shining Kubrick style, I don't think at any point where are we surprised or like traumatized by Jack's insane behavior at the end. But we are horrified by it because it's scary, right? There's something about his performance that again is so simultaneously human, because there's no ghosts or haunting in it, but it's also the antithesis of how we understand humanity, down to the faces that Nicholson can make, right? That feel uncanny, right? There's an uncanniness to Kubrick's Jack that isn't present in King's.
Yeah, and I think that just goes down to the reason that, at least at the Overlook, that Jack fails so spectacularly in King's is not necessarily because of him as a human person. It's more because it's like, obviously it's a whole extended metaphor for addiction and giving in to your worst habits, and these ghosts allow him to tap into his worst impulses, and that's the reason why everything ultimately is so bad. In Kubrick's version, the reason that Jack messes up is because he's a fundamentally broken human being. And for me, watching this broken human being having to, for a little while in the beginning when there are other people, try to masquerade as a normal person is deeply interesting. And then seeing this broken human being being put in this isolated location and undergoing cabin fever, something that even at our best, humans are not good at doing. And this is someone who is at their worst. He's being forced into this situation. I just find that really compelling. And, of course, then Kubrick is able to shoot that in such an interesting and compelling way that really just, like, it forces you to be a voyeur into a situation in which no one would want to be a voyeur in.
And I'm glad you mentioned in there how he shot it, right? So the cinematography. This is where I can't help but appreciate this film. The film and Kubrick's, decisions as the director for particularly shooting the Overlook. It's no secret, I really like films that make us question our awareness of place. And whereas in The Shining, the King novel, I feel like I could navigate that space. I wouldn't want to, but like I would know how to get from like the caregiver's cabin down to the kitchen because we've kind of gone on that journey. Kubrick denies us that in the film. It is disjointed. It is broken. It is maze-like. And of course some of that is to mimic the affect of a hotel, right? In the sense that like when we're in a hotel, it always feels weirdly the same, right? The sort of placelessness of like, I've been here. Yeah, but it's more than that, right? So it's also a placelessness, because even though we should, because the characters by the time they've been in this hotel for a long time know where things are, we're denied the sort of establishing shots that we would need to understand the Overlook. And even though we see a lot of it, right, we see so much of it from that low camera height, not angled, which is so brilliant, where we're following Danny from behind and we actually cannot see what's in front of him, which is just fantastic. And so it feels, I'm going to go back to that word broken, right? It feels so broken and it's beautiful. Like, it is the most beautiful depiction of a hotel or of a place that I can think of in most films. I just think it's beautiful.
And I think
so that is important.
The placelessness of the Overlook and the Overlook is not a character in Kubrick's version. It is a location that is to be probed and prodded in and to terrify us, but it's not a character. And I think the placelessness is really important to Kubrick, and hence why we have to see the third act change. The third act is where a lot of significant alterations occur within the actual linear narratives of both texts, because really up until the third act, there are backstories that get cut, and a lot of things are condensed for the film. Like, there is no extended sequence before the Overlook in the film. We're immediately driving to the Overlook. And that's a significant change, but technically, in terms of linear story, that's not a change. It's just, it's a change of where we start, but it's not a change of the story per se. But the third act has to change, I think, because this placelessness is far more important to Kubrick than it is to Stephen King. And we literally are in a maze in which we are denied the opportunity to know what it looks like. We are never, ever giving any shots that help cue the audience in on where these two characters are in relationship to each other, Danny and Jack. It's horrifying. At any moment, you could turn the corner, Danny could turn the corner and Jack is right there and he is killed. That's terrifying.
And if I can, this is going to sound like the most ridiculous statement that has ever been uttered. But for me, the third acts reveal what I believe in my heart is like a fundamental truth. And that is that I don't actually think of Stephen King as a horror writer. I think of him as a fantastic writer who really understands the things that cause us fear and anxiety. And yes, he's using horror tropes, but at the end of the day, his narratives are about the inherent potential goodness of people. And then I don't know if I think that's what horror is. And I realize, like, how can you say something's not horror if it's about a haunted hotel where a man's trying to kill his family? And I would say the third act is how you cannot say it, because at the end, you know, he goes through with it in the novel. He, knowing that he's going to save his family in doing so, you know, the chef comes back and saves them. You know, I mean, that's, whereas you're right that the third act in Kubrick's film, that is horror, because we understand that there's no escaping this monster in this place that is broken and meaningless, and that's a huge difference, right? It's so much more than just the addition of a maze scene. It's the, like you said, it's the creation of something that feels horrifying or terrifying in a way that the novel doesn't.
And I think that it's just an overarching thing of, like, Stephen King, if you do want to consider it horror, you at the very least have to say it is incredibly affirmative horror, because ultimately at the end of the day, their family is kind of allowed to get out, and they're not living the most normal life, but actually at the end in that epilogue they kind of are. It's like,
yeah, I was gonna say, it's not until Doctor Sleep really that we understand that it's a little bit more broken than we thought it was. Yeah, but you know, King has out said that's right, that it should make you kind of see what's taboo and then celebrate what's good.
Yeah, whereas with Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining, he is doing an incredibly disaffirmative adaptation, which I think from the absolute start, and the third act really just drives that home, because it is cold and relentless, and we see Jack freeze in a way that the novel doesn't allow us to, because Jack is blown up, but that's kind of in the abstract. It's not as powerful or as cold or menacing as seeing Jack then run around this maze trying to kill his son, and then only to then literally be left frozen solid.
Yes.
Out there.
Yeah, the Shining Kubrick style is about what happens when we have family members who are what are known as, like, family annihilators, right? The people, I think that's the official term to refer to people who end up killing family members, right? And you're right, we see it from start to finish, and just because he dies at the end, right, doesn't in any way alleviate, I don't think, the threat of this type of character, right?
It's profoundly disaffirmative. These characters are broken and traumatized at the end of Kubrick's version, and we're led to believe that they're not going to be okay. They're not going to be able to live a normal, happy life, and after this is Danny is definitely going to be traumatized forever. What's the name of the
Wendy.
I was like Shelley Duvall. Wendy is definitely broken by the end, yes, in a way that's just not true in the novel.
And I have to say, when it comes to the Wendy character, so I do have a couple things that don't thrill me about the film, and I know that this is going to be something that a lot of people are going to disagree with me on, but I don't like Shelley Duvall's Wendy, and I don't like Shelley Duvall's Wendy precisely because she does a perfect job of making the Wendy that this film needs, and that is that she's a broken shell of a woman from the start. Because we are supposed to understand, like you said, that this brokenness, this violence would happen no matter what. It's just allowed to happen a little bit faster in the overload,
in the isolation that cabin fever produces.
But that, you know, that this is clearly a family that has been manipulated and scarred long before they face the horror of the hotel, and so she does a fantastic job of being that version of Wendy. It's just a lot for me to stomach as someone who really does need, as much as possible, strong developed female characters, and I have yet to encounter many film auteurs, particularly that are of the age of Kubrick, but also like Hitchcock, and most of them, right? Like there's a whole list of them. They're not good at crafting female characters worth anything. And that's hard. It is hard for me to be okay with that.
I don't, and I think the only reason that it is kind of passable for me is because I don't think that Kubrick wants you to be okay with how Wendy is being treated, because it's like, no, obviously, if you're married to this monster manipulator who is Jack, you would never be allowed to be developed as a person. You would never be allowed to be independent of this character. He wouldn't allow it. And so I don't know if we're supposed to be okay or comfortable with this depiction, but still, that doesn't negate the fact that we do still, as an audience, have to see this woman be constantly put through hell and is not allowed to be a character.
Yeah, I think the reason that I can't just see it as a sort of isolated to the narrative is that I feel like it is a discernible pattern in other Kubrick films.
It is. So you're absolutely right. And so
I can't say, oh, well, this is his intent, even if it is his intent, right? This is his intent in his film, because I think it's a very clearly seen sort of thing that he just kind of does, right? But you're right. It is the character we need for this particular version. The other thing that I have a quibble about that I just think is worth mentioning, because I was watching a documentary yesterday and it referenced this scene and it reminded me that I'm bothered by it. The few times that we do see the ghosts or the party goers, the revelers, there's a queerness to them that is explicit, right? I mean, there's like a scene where we are more or less aware that someone is giving someone else a blowjob, right? Like, and I must admit that I do grow rather tired, and as particularly in a film that's 1980s, so we're talking, smack dab in the middle of our sort of gay phobia version, like as if we've ever gotten over it, but the big 80s version of gay phobia, and there's a queerness to the revelers that suggests that what is disturbing about them is the fact that they are queer, not only queer as in terms of sexual orientation, but in terms of their affect, right? The way they dress, the fact that they are engaging in frivolity that is not appropriate to the moment, and that I must admit also doesn't really sit very well with me. I'm glad we had this conversation, because I feel like my appreciation for Kubrick's film has risen. It didn't, my appreciation for the novel remains steady and strong. But I'm glad we talked through this, because I think I can appreciate this film, this adaptation set more, because you've reminded me that it is a great film. It is an interesting adaptation. It is not a faithful adaptation.
No, and I don't think Kubrick is ever intending it to be a faithful adaptation. I truly think if you ask Kubrick about issues of fidelity, he would be like, "Why are you even talking about this? This is go read your book."
And I will say that the result of that is something we don't get in a lot of film adaptations, and that is that it is a masterful film.
Yeah.
Right? Like, a lot of times film adaptations are, like, movies that just happen to be on film.
Uh-huh.
Right? But, like, like it or not, he pays attention to cinematography in a way that you cannot ignore.
Yeah, I'm also really...
And sound.
Yeah,
and sound. We didn't even talk about sound.
I'm also really glad that we had this conversation. I still think ultimately, at the end of the day, I am going to gravitate towards horror texts that are disaffirmative in nature. So how Kubrick views the cabin fever and this dysfunction of character is more interesting to me than what Stephen King's more affirmative worldview lends itself to in the novel. But I'm always happy to talk about that Stephen King novel, because I really do think it is also an excellent work. It's just I perhaps agree more with the disaffirmative viewpoint that Kubrick will use.
Yeah, it goes back to the source of horror, right? Which one grabs you and keeps the hold of you in the dark of the night? And we didn't talk at all about the music, which is a pity, both because that score is iconic, but also because there are more adaptations.
Oh yeah. We're going to be doing something pretty special for this episode. We're going to hope to be doing more often, and that we're going to be, if you enjoyed this episode and you're like, I want a little bit more, well, we've got more for you. We're going to be releasing 2 videos on YouTube that go a little bit deeper into an opera adaptation of The Shining, and then we're going to be going a little bit more of a deep dive into adaptation theory in a separate video.
I cannot wait to talk a little bit more about the opera that neither of us have seen, but both of us have strong feelings about anyway. It's exciting.
And so those links, that link to our YouTube channel is obviously in the description of this podcast, as is the links to all of our social medias. Be sure to give us a like, check out our videos there, and of course share us with your friends. Word of mouth is the best way to get us out there.
And we hope that you will join us for our next podcast episode, which is continuing our exploration of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. And so we will be looking at Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge.
Thanks for joining us. Have a great day.